The next question we're looking for is on this theme of cultivating a culture of care, is how we do this. So we're going to hear from 4 of the leading practical experts who are actually achieving this in many different ways. First of all, I'd like to invite up to the stage, hopefully they're out there and can just press their join the stage buttons. I'd like to invite up Benna Waits. Now, Benna is a consultant psychologist in the NHS, so she's helping run an organisation with thousands of people, which has come under considerable strain over the last year, as we know. I'd also like to invite Steve Chalke. He's, well, you will know as the founder of the Oasis Charitable Trust and the Oasis Academy chain, and we are increasingly familiar with him as a commentator on the Today programme and elsewhere, so we're very lucky to have him here today. And I'd like to also invite up Ruth Young. Now, Ruth heads up Jamie's farm in Hereford, the farm in Hereford, and so she is, if you like, implementing the approach that we were hearing about earlier. So it would be great to hear a little bit more of detail around that. And last but definitely not least, we're lucky to be joined by Andy Holmes. Now, Andy is this is a great title to have, I think, the Global Head of Wellbeing. The Global Head of Wellbeing for Reckitt Benckiser, I think I've pronounced that correctly, I'm sure you'll correct me if I haven't, which is, again, a timely organisation. It's one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies, and we're very keenly aware at the moment how important that is. So, should we care more about a caring culture, or should we just tell our staff to toughen up? That's really the first question for us, and I'm going to start on this with Benna. What's your take on this, and how do we do it in practice?
Thanks, James. So I work in an NHS organisation that employs around about 13,000 staff, and as part of my role I get involved in thinking about wellbeing across our organisation. And I think that some of what we do, despite some of the differences in our core business, has real relevance for education and social care settings. Firstly, I'd really like to just challenge this notion of toughening up, which I think relates to a really unhelpful idea that is sadly all too prevalent of resilience as some kind of endurance sport. So it seems to me that part of being strong is sometimes being able to admit that we're struggling. Sometimes being part of not being okay is being not okay. And I guess there's something about admitting vulnerability that feels like a really powerful thing to do in the process of wellbeing. So just wanted to challenge that idea of toughening up, because I don't think it's a very helpful one and it's not very well supported by the evidence. So why should we care about wellbeing? For many of us, I think it feels like the right thing to do. It just feels like it's kind of part of the work. And I think you really heard that when Jamie and Tish were talking earlier. Working with people, particularly people who've suffered trauma, adversity, can be really overwhelming at times. And actually, part of taking care of their well-being is making sure that we don't break people. It just feels like the right thing to do. But actually, there's a growing evidence base that says that when we take care of well-being, actually performance improves. There's a really clear relationship between those things. So staff that are thriving do a better job. And I think there's a really helpful confluence of that kind of, there are some of us that get there because we think it's the right thing to do, and some people get there because it's maximizing performance, but essentially we all need to be pulling in the same direction. What does it mean to care about well-being? So for us, it's not just an individual reactive response. So it's really important, if you have staff members that are really distressed, to be able to pick that up, to offer counselling, to be able to offer support, whatever that looks like. But it also feels very important to think about it at a systems proactive level. So when we were preparing for this, and I hope Steve won't mind me shamelessly pinching his analogy, because I thought it was so perfect for making this point, and I'm worried he won't get around to saying it. If people keep falling in the river, do you keep on throwing life rings, or do you build a bridge? So I think we need to create conditions where people are able to sustain themselves and not burn out. Ultimately, to keep giving care, you need to be taken care of. And that's a responsibility that needs to be held by organisations as well as individuals.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I think given that you've stolen Steve's line, which I'm sure is culturally slightly a bit of an issue. I'd like to invite Steve. Look, Ben has given a fantastic overview of this. You're actually doing this on a significant scale in your schools and in your charities. What's your approach?
Well, I agree with everything that Ben has said, and was fascinated by what Jamie and Tish were saying earlier. Really, I've made loads of notes. Thank you very much, everybody. So I'm stealing ideas as well, because there's so much wisdom. I would say this, we have probably 5,000-6,000 staff around the country, and we work in our schools with around 32,000 children, and then with lots of young people beyond that, and countless volunteers. We have more volunteers than staff, thousands and thousands of them. And I've learned this. You learn through the mistakes you make, that in order to create the kind of organization that Tish was talking about, you need to think about the stress within the organization. Oasis is just about to take on what's called the UK's first secure school, which is an alternative to youth jail. We're going to open that next year with the Ministry of Justice, and we're told that what we need to provide is a trauma-aware environment, a trauma-sensitive environment, understanding young people's fears, not starting with the question, what have you done wrong, but what's happened to you, and slowly unpacking that. But what I've become more and more aware of, I think I knew already, but I can perhaps articulate more clearly now because of the 2-year preparation for this, is that a traumatized system will always create traumatized staff, and that in turn will lead to traumatizing of children, which was the wonderful thing about what Tish and Jamie were saying. It's to understand that creating a system where your staff and volunteers thrive, where they feel comfortable in their own skin, enables them to then stand in the shoes of someone else. Traumatized systems create traumatized staff, traumatized policies, and that traumatizes the young people that we're working with, or anyone else. But if you create that opportunity for people to rejoice in who they are without that stress, then you see something different. To illustrate that point, at the moment, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that we all know, whatever political view people have around schools, which is, you know, one of the things I'm very involved in, the Secretary of State goes on TV on Friday night and announces that schools have all got to be doing this, that, or whatever else it is by Monday morning. That creates stress and trauma in the system to staff that are overworked and exhausted, because they've now got to work all weekend to get in place whatever it was that was being put in place over this last year. By Tuesday morning, there's a new piece of guidance that reverses all of that. More stress, more trauma is created. Then in the middle of the pandemic, Ofsted comes round, and we don't know where we are with exams or mocks or not, or what it might be, etc., etc. And then there's the threat of the league tables. All of this builds stress in the system. And then you're the head of a school. So you end up feeling like, I've got to perform or else I'm out of a job. So I've got to hold these heads of year or heads of subject to account. And that trickles all the way down, all the way through to the mum that steps into reception with having had a bad morning. So that's why I thought what Jamie and Trish were saying was fantastic, because it starts where this needs to start, because garbage in, terrible stuff out, great input in, you create the kind of environment you're looking for.
Steve, that's a passionate message to the Secretary of State for Education. But just to challenge you a little gnat on that, it could sound like you're kind of just saying, look, there's nothing we can do about it, and it's all of these problems are being put down on us. And of course, we're in the business in this webinar of finding out what we actually can do about it. And I'm sure you in your schools, you're not passing on, you're holding that stress. How do you do that?
Yes, well, exactly, and I'm not trying to make excuses for anything. I'm just talking about the fact that very often, as a young person comes to Jamie's Farm, of course, Oasis in Waterloo runs a little mini Jamie's Farm. It's a partnership between the two of us, and this whole idea that came to me from Jamie and Jake and others of farming therapy, working with these young people who are just looking for a place to find peace. Of course, that can only happen for them when those of us who can create the systems to allow that to happen. So Oasis is, like all other great good educators, working hard at this all of the time. But I believe it is the task of our generations, because if you stretch back to before the 1990s, nobody ever used the word neuroscience. I think Freud did once or twice and then abandoned it. It was in the late 1990s that, because of the MRI scanner, we could look into a brain and we could see what happens to a human brain when this stress is caused. So we got to build systems, haven't we, and build environments that allow human beings to develop differently, that the success of those who are friendly.
That leads me really neatly onto Ruth, and Jamie's Farm is seeking to do that and essentially build a system where young people can thrive. But as we've been hearing, you need to get the adults to thrive. What's your take on this? Toughen up versus caring culture. I'm guessing you're not going to say toughen up, but what's your take on how you can achieve it?
Thank you, James, and it's really lovely to be on such a panel. It's also really lovely to hear Tish say no one's ever an expert. I feel much more comfortable having heard her say that. The word toughen up, just like Benna looked at, I wanted to talk about for a minute, just because, we are presented with children who are presenting as tough. They've been through tough situations and they've built hard exteriors to deal with that. So the last thing we want them to do is toughen up. Actually, we want them to open up. We want them to feel hopeful. We want them to trust, and we want them to feel that the world and they have potential. If we were meeting them and saying that, but actually coming from a place of put up or shut up in any sort of way, well, at best it would be incongruous, but I think ultimately it wouldn't work. Like Tish said, it was great to hear her say, it's that authenticity that anyone who works with young people knows and can tell and won't listen to it if that authenticity isn't there. And I would actually say that we all get that sense. So that has to echo throughout the organisation from the very top. That's why it's so wonderful to hear Tish and Jamie speaking the way that they do, all the way through the organisation, that authentic belief in what you're doing, and that the strategies to help us hold to that are really important. The other word in the question is thrive. Now, I was an English teacher once upon a time, and so I looked this word up in the dictionary. We use it all the time, but I looked it up in the dictionary, and it means to develop and grow. And that really excited me because, well, for two reasons, really. One is that we use it in businesses, we use it with people, we also use it in nature and with agriculture and with plants. And we know that to have a successful farm, each thing needs different conditions. Each plant, each animal needs different soil, different water, different to be put out at a different type of year. Now, they might need hardening up, sometimes slowly, supporting to get to a certain place, but they definitely need to be seen as individuals. And I can't emphasize enough how pleased I was to see that's what thriving carried. And the other thing was then taking that further, that idea, it has movement in the word thrive. It has change to develop. And as a teacher, I think we know that the best moments of change and development often come at moments of challenge. In fact, they come at moments sometimes of failing and being able to cope with that failure and move forwards and move on. And so I think that seeing moments of challenge as moments of growth is something that Jamie's farm does really well, because we're seeing the individuals that we're working with. We know them incredibly well. And so we're able to help them thrive. So no, not toughen up, but build resilience, harden up slowly through looking at the individual and through feeling a safe enough space that failure isn't something we're worried about.
Ruth, that's so fascinating, really, to hear, and yeah, really resonates with me. The importance of treating people as individuals, the moments of challenge, and you're not sort of dismissing the idea of toughening up. Actually, it's just you can actually use it. Could be the right moment, the right plant, the right animal, the right child could be appropriate. So I'm just going to come on to Andy now, because one thing that's interesting, Andy, is how you've been hearing how schools, how Jamie's farm operates around, thinks about culture. You're thinking about it on a massive global scale, in fact. And
yeah.
My perception is that business is well ahead of education when it comes to thinking about the importance of culture, and that actually it's one area where education could learn from business. Although listening to some of the speakers, everybody's got something to learn from everybody, and I particularly like what Steve said, that the best learning moments when you make mistakes. Well, what are you learning from this, and what has education got to learn from what you're doing?
Well, I mean, firstly, I would tip my hat if I was wearing one to all of the panel guests. And I mean, it was like buzzword bingo sat here, I've got to be honest. First of all, Jamie and Trish, the stuff that you talk about is so inspiring. The way that you're approaching what you do, you talked about emotional honesty, about consistency, congruence, maintaining authenticity. These are all the absolute bedrocks of the things that I think really drive what we're trying to get to here. I had 3 words written down, and Ruth, congratulations. I think I got my first row with you, but I'd written down safety, trust, and hope. Now, I'm a big believer in that our environment dictates our emotional response, our moods, which influences our behavior, ultimately which becomes culture. The culture is the collection of our cumulative behaviors. The other thing that I'm really we're really focused on with RB, and we have about 48,000 people across 72 countries, so it's a big beast. But what I would say is that listening to what you guys are talking about, we can learn from you. So there may be a couple of bits that we do, but I think the way that you're approaching is the human-centric nature of the way that you're approaching this is incredibly powerful. The way that we're thinking about it is from a basis of survive, perform, and thrive. So obviously there's a performance element to it, business context, but survive, perform, and thrive. It used to be survive, thrive, perform. And to Ruth's point, we got to a point where we thought, you know what, you can actually be performing and delivering and be really unhappy in doing it. So the thing for us is, from a basic provision point of view, the provision of and access to and support must be a right, not a privilege. So that's the basis of everything. Have people got the basics to survive? Are they getting things like lunch breaks? Are they getting downtime? Are they getting time with their families? And are they doing that in a guilt-free way? Because that's the key piece. We employ people who are passionate and committed. I'm sure like the NHS and all of the, the charitable organizations do. But the danger with that is that people overgive. And when they overgive, you start to compromise yourself and your own survival and your own sort of psychological safety. The next piece stuff from that is, once you build this consistency, and to Tish talk to emotional honesty and congruence, this is about repetitive behaviors that demonstrate trust, that demonstrate authenticity, that demonstrate hope and safety. And if you get that, then people will start to commit and start to get involved. But the bit on top of that is the freedom to allow people to be emotionally themselves. And that's where the thriving bit, to Ruth's point, that for me is where the thriving bit comes from. In business, we talk a lot about inclusion. We talk a lot about collaboration. We talk a lot about innovation. These are all things that we do when we give discretionary effort. Now, we give discretionary effort when we feel safe, when we feel engaged, committed, and when we feel it will be reciprocated, which comes to the altruistic piece that Chris talked to. When we feel good about giving, we will give more. Now, the choice to give is the big bit here for me. The choice to give comes from the place that I feel safe, I feel hopeful, And I feel that those around me are the same. So, you know, when we come back to the point about, you know, is this as important for the staff or should they just toughen up? I think it's more important for the staff, because the staff set the tone and set the level of authenticity and congruence. If you want the kids to be open to say when they're not feeling safe, as opposed to putting on a shield of armor and fighting you for it, they have to see our staff do that first. And I think, you know, I was listening to all of you and I was thinking, you know what, I want to take this recording and play it back to our leaders, because I think in business, you know, we go all the time. We're always on. You know, I was in a panel with an explorer, Nick Hollis, about 2 weeks ago. And he said, with regards to resilience, he said, when do you get strong? And he said, in the adventure world, we get strong when we rest and recover. In the business world, you don't get the time to do that. You don't get the opportunity. You're always on. So I think for me, it's about, do you have a safe space that allows people, staff included, to say, you know what, I'm feeling unsafe. I'm feeling overstretched. I need to recover. I need to get strong again. So for me, these are really, really key points.
And that's fascinating, and I think that sort of really basic concept of safety, trust, hope is what I'm taking away, and the consistency. Now there are a bunch of good questions and good points cropping up on the questions and chat channel. So I just wanted to share a bit of them. I particularly like Lucy's comment about how language is important and how using the right words can actually take away stress, and she also adds the point that we need playfulness as well. Definitely true. But I wanted to pick up on something that Richard has chucked into the chat, and I wanted to ask Steve about this. So historically, we've had the watchwords of stiff upper lip and toughen up, and we are rightly moving away from that. But is there a danger of the pendulum swinging too far? And you know, could the going away from toughening up mean that we just, I don't know, we get flabby, we lose our focus on what we're trying to achieve as organizations, which is often for young people themselves? Do we lose our focus? Is that a risk?
That's a great question. As we had just been awarded this opportunity to develop this secure school, this youth jail. Now, I should say that the young people that will be sentenced to us would have murdered, raped. You won't be there because you peddled drugs or stole stuff from Sainsbury's. So I was questioned by the leader of the spokesman for justice in the House of Lords. Came to see me, sat down, had a coffee together, and they said, so tell me, what's your strategy? And I said, it's love. Relentless love. And they looked at me and said, relentless love and what? And I said, relentless love and nothing. And they said, but isn't that soft? Isn't that easy? And I said, what's easy is locking a kid in a cell for 18 hours a day. What's easy is creating rules and regulations and not engaging in relationship with people. That's easy. That's always easy. To engage in relationship with people, to understand them, is a hard thing. Underneath Richard's question, James, Patricia's made a statement or a question about that it makes her think about the school curriculum and how we failed to respond to the current needs of society. So here's the thing about the curriculum, it's the same thing. So should the child fit the curriculum or the curriculum fit the child? Tough. Let's set the curriculum and let's have all these exams in place and make the kids leap, you know, over this fence, this hurdle, or put on this suit of armor or fit into this straitjacket. And if they can do that, they're a success. But it's not a one size fits all, is it? It's harder, much, much tougher and much, much harder to think, what are the strengths of this child? What are the skills of this child? What are the needs of this child? And how do we develop a curriculum, a 21st century world-leading curriculum that understands that child? It's exactly what Andy's just been saying about the world of business. It's the same everywhere, isn't it? If I am understood and seen and heard and am comfortable in my skin, then I can stand in your shoes and begin to meet your needs. It's as simple as that, but it's really tough thing to pull off.
And I think just building on that, Steve, because one of the challenges we have, in the business world, and I think it's equally applicable. We have a lot of ex-educators or current educators in the organisation. Is that it's not always about completely changing the curriculum, but it's about being able to have the agility to change the context of the curriculum to fit the individual, so that they feel relevant, so that they feel connection with it, and so that they feel that they belong to something. I think my brother-in-law actually works with a similar charity, and one of the things he finds difficult is that what a lot of people, especially with the COVID world, we're obsessed with connection. We're obsessed with putting people together. That's not what people are looking for. What people are looking for is belonging. If you belong somewhere, you do so because you feel emotionally safe, emotionally connected, emotionally supported. And I think this is the bit. It's about how do we use our soft skills to frame the context of what is available for these people, so that it feels of value, so that it feels for them, so that it feels like it's going to enable them and they can connect with it and engage in it. Thanks.
And I'm having a sense, I love the relentless love, by the way, Steve, and you're getting a bit of affection for that in the channel. And what I'd love to move us on to, because I think we're in danger of violently agreeing, is how we actually enact this. How do we make it happen? I'd love to come to Benna. Just what are some of the things that you advise people to think about when trying to create this culture? How do we do it?
So there's a whole range of ways that we have tried to enact this, and it's lovely. You're quite right about the violent agreement. I'm loving relentless love, and that notion of creating cultures where people feel valued and a high sense of belonging is absolutely critical. I want to just introduce the notion of psychological safety. We've invested quite a lot of time in thinking about psychological safety in our teams, and that's a concept that's been pioneered by Professor Amy Edmondson at Harvard, which is about voice. So it's about people being able to raise issues, questions, concerns within teams. It's about being able to look at failure without fear of punishment, shaming, humiliation. And it's a really powerful idea. And certainly the evidence seems to be suggesting that it's highly correlated with systems that perform well, staff that thrive. In healthcare, safety is a huge issue for us. So systems that work safely. So we're particularly interested in it because the health service is very hierarchical, and actually we think that gives us problems with voice. And I suspect that also applies to education. So I'd really recommend looking at that work. For us, it's also about leadership. So this stuff absolutely can happen in kind of small pockets, and we see that across systems, but actually getting your top-down approach right, making sure that people understand the work of leadership. So we've invested in developing compassionate leadership training programs to support our leaders understand the work of leadership. So that's really important for us. We do something called Schwartz Rounds. I don't know if people have come across that. That's something that was developed by a Boston lawyer called Ken Schwartz, who was dying of lung cancer in his 40s. What he noticed was that it was in his caregivers, it was the small acts of human kindness that made the unbearable bearable. And I think what he's referring to there is that sense, what's been talked about lots today around authenticity, connection, but it's how we hold people in the work. So the Schwartz Foundation that was set up after his death set up this thing called Schwartz Rounds, which is where you bring a group of staff together to share food and then to tell stories. So essentially you have 3 panelists who talk about some ways in which the work has impacted upon them. And then there's a general discussion. And we found those really powerful. We run them across hospitals, across our health board in Aneurin, Bevan, and they've been extraordinary catalysts of culture change in terms of the kinds of conversations people have with us, with each other. So that's really powerful. And the last thing I want to flag is something called compassion practices. This is something particularly close to my heart. There's a website that I'm hoping will get posted in the chat that we've recently launched, which is developing a series of, these are structured conversations, generally taking no more than an hour, and some of them are much shorter than that. But they're conversations that are oriented towards facilitating voice. So essentially there's turn taking, there's lots of really good listening, but focused on self-care, on connection, and on the values that underpin our work. And they're really powerful. We've done them with over 1,000 staff, and the feedback is extraordinary in terms of the way that it shifts people to be to connect with each other and to take better care of themselves. So yeah, it feels like there's a whole range of things you can do, but I guess the really important point is that well-being is it's not a soft, fluffy, optional, extra, nice to have. It feels like it's a fundamental factor underlying the quality and safety of our services, and something that we need to design into our systems to sustain it.
And on that point, that was really fascinating. And just to flag for people, we have put in the chat section more information about compassion practices. And I'd love to pick up your psychological safety point that you started with and come over to Ruth, because I'd just like to hear a bit more about the practicalities of what that psychological safety looks like, because I know that at Jamie's Farm you have this concept of safe spaces, for example, where people can raise things if they have concerns. Just talk us through a little bit of that. How does that work?
Well, we're really lucky at Jamie's Farm because everything that we do week in, week out is built to support people feeling safe, communicating honestly, opening up. So I will rattle through some of the practices that we do with both the young people and with our teams. So we will do check-ins where everyone is a bit like, I mean, Benna has actually run one once for me, where everyone in the circle has the chance to speak, to check in. We do it with the young people and sometimes with the staff as well, giving a number of where you are between 1 and 10 and why you're feeling that way right now. And the staff will do that without the young people there at the beginning and the end of the week, parking their weekend, whatever that's brought, so that they can release some of that to come into the week with the young people as well as they can. And then at the end of the week, parking what can have been a tiring week. And within that, there are other wonderful things we do. We do shout outs, which is a recognition of the people that we're working with, an appreciation of some small thing that they've done in the week. Sometimes we'll do a bit teachery, but we'll do an even better if, so a reflection on our own practice and what went well and what we're proud of in our own practice. All of those things we do within a circle with proper turn taking, phones off, you know, giving it as much respect for our team as we do for the young people. And I think that that's really important. Often in these practices, you know, if it's going to get lost, it'll get lost within the team. But also we're really lucky that all the informal stuff that we get to do with young people, and that is vital that adults do, we sit round a table and we have a beautiful home cooked meal that feels nurturing, that feels cared for, and we chat and we talk about ordinary things. And I wanted to say, you know, lots of people feel like in schools you can't do that, but I trained in a school, quite a maverick head teacher, but he had a teaching assistant who every morning in the tiny little staff kitchen, sometimes with a young person who was struggling to be in the classroom, she would cook homemade flapjacks and make really good quality coffee. And as I taught at the top of the building, the smells of that would drift up and I'd be thinking towards, you know, how wonderful that was going to be. What that meant was that all the staff came to the staff room at break time. They all spoke to each other with smiles on their faces because they were being given this nurture. So, I mean, at Jamie's Farming, we're incredibly lucky because we have these things built into our daily routines, but they are possible in other situations.
And that's what I want to come on to just finally, because we're actually, hard to believe, but we're actually running out of time on this discussion because this is so fascinating. So just summing up what you just said in the chat, it's not survival of the fittest, it's survival of the nurtured. And you raised the question, you said, look, we've built it into the fabric of Jamie's Farm. How do other organizations, whether it's the education world, Steve, or the business world, Andy, how can you take that and build it into the structure of your organizations rather than trying to sort of leverage it in? I'll just give the last but one word to Andy and then come finally to Steve. Andy.
I think one of the biggest things for me is the old sort of industrial revolution model of top down has its merits, but bottom up crowdsourcing has a lot of momentum. And I think, you know, for years and years and years, corporates have worked with consultancies, and, you know, we've created sets of values and behaviors and all this sort of stuff that gets cascaded down and everyone has to follow. There's a huge incongruence and inauthenticity to that. And I think, you know, what we're coming to realize is that, you know, and I always refer to this as millisecond lessons. So it's the tiny little day-to-day experiences that people have that create culture, that create social norms, that create expectations in the business. The danger is that if you do top down, you create a lot of expectation, a lot of anticipation, and quite often we underdeliver on that. So my real push would be, at worst, go top down, bottom up. Don't just go top down. I think that's the sort of the key piece. You know, we see it all over the internet, influencers, bloggers, ambassadors, all this sort of stuff. We've got to move with the times. We're not in an environment now where you only listen to the leader. People listen to all of the noise that's around them. So I think the way that we're looking at it is how do we embrace that environment rather than trying to condition people to continue to function the old way? How do we embrace the environment that we know people are in? And how do we influence? How do we set examples? How do we set a tone of consistency and trust in order to make that the norm that people want to come towards?
It's fascinating, and it's amazing to see how businesses like yours are really grasping this and thinking about it. Steve, what when you hear that and then you look at the education system, how do you feel? How optimistic are you that we can build a culture of compassion and caring in our education system?
I'm very optimistic. You know, there's a psychological theory. There are many of them, aren't there? Which is called referred attribution error theory. And what it basically means is when I do something wrong, when I'm rude, when I'm unkind, it's because I'm tired. It's because I've had a hard day. It's because I sat on Zoom calls all day long. It's because I've not had anything to eat. It's because I didn't get much sleep the night before. It's because I had a tough weekend. When you do something wrong, James, it's because you're morally broken. You see? So we give ourselves a better ride than anyone else. One of the psychologists I work with, he's got this great little thing. So he says he's a dick, but there's a reason he's a dick. In other words, there's always a reason why I behave in a self-centered way. And there's a thing behind the thing, a story behind the story. So what we have within Oasis, we have something which we call our TIP group, our trauma-informed practice group. And it's a multidisciplinary group from across the organization. We run lots of housing, education, community projects, etc., etc. And what it's still in the process of developing is what I call, but it won't be called in the end, an Oasis theory of everything. So in other words, how do you boil all this down practically? Not wrongly accrediting the other guy with what you wouldn't accredit yourself with. And so it's how do you write a good email? How do you make a helpful phone call to a colleague? How do you have a good conversation? When there's conflict, because no community can be at peace unless it's willing to address conflict. If you push conflict under the carpet, actually the community crumbles. How do you address conflict well? And what we're working hard on is spelling all this out, because it's easy to talk about being caring, selfless, honest. It's easy to talk about being resilient. What does that actually mean in practice? So we're working at those things all of the time, remembering that when I do something wrong, I know why I did it. I was having a hard day. So let me afford that same thing to someone else and work at these things together.
Steve, that's a great point to wrap up the discussion, and I'm glad you're going to give me that rather than tell me I'm a complete idiot when I make a mistake. And well, thank you so much to this wonderful panel. As somebody has already stolen my thought, a sublime contribution from everybody. And for those who didn't manage to capture everything that you said, we have actually managed to put some of the content from the rich points that you made in the chat, if you want to follow up on things like the Schwartz Rounds, which I definitely want to find out more about, and psychological safety and so on and so forth. It's in the chat. So thank you, everybody. You were great. And I'm going to move on from this fascinating conversation to the next stage of our session on creating a culture of caring. So we heard a bit there